Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm an English teacher and a slow reader, and I am from Finland. And this year I read 5 Finnish books, which is much more than I usually do. Usually it's 1, 2. The last time I read this many books was for my literature minor studies. I read 6 books in a year then. That was in 2016. 5 books is a lot more than usually. And I don't know, I just don't usually gravitate towards Finnish literature. I don't know what it is. I just don't find topics that interest me. And when it comes to like translated literature, I usually prefer to read the English original book or English translation. But this year I read 5, and my goal is to find more Finnish books that I would enjoy. I felt like a major point of interest and genre that I enjoyed reading is historical fiction of Finnish history, but lots of Finnish historical fiction focuses on war era. So are the books that I read this year. What I liked about these books that they focused on the human experience of the war years instead of just focusing on what happened in the battlefield. Quick history lesson. So Finland was under the Swedish rule for about 500 years, from the 1300s to 1800s, and then after that it was under Russian rule for 100 years, and then Finland became independent in 1917. So because of the 500 years of Swedish rule, there is a major impact of that time in Finnish society to this day. Why am I telling you this? Well, 3 of these books are written by Finnish authors whose first language is Swedish. In Finland, there is a community of Swedish-speaking Finnish people because of the history of this country, and Swedish is also the second official language in Finland as well. Finnish authors, but 3 of these books were originally first written in Swedish. So I thought I would go through these books in the order that I read them in. And the first Finnish book that I read this year was Frida and Frida by Emma Juslin. I read it in the spring, and this was a book that I found from a recycling shelf at the library, and I figured, well, this sounds interesting, I'll pick it up. So the book shares the perspective of 2 characters, and each chapter alternates between the perspectives of these characters. So first it's one character's perspective, and then the following chapter is the other character's perspective. So the first perspective that we are given is a 13-year-old girl, Selmas. Selma is a 13-year-old girl. She has a big family. She lives in the Finnish countryside in a Swedish-speaking Finnish community. Things about her life as a 13-year-old. She thinks about her family, her parents, her siblings, her friends, her community, and so on. The second perspective in this book is of Irina, who is Selma's older sister. Irina is 20 years old and she studies art in Paris. Irina is majorly inspired by Frida Kahlo, hence why she has chosen to go to art school. And then in the art school, she finds herself a girlfriend whose name is also Frida, and she is from Sweden, and she apparently looks a little bit like Frida as well. So her perspective is about how she doesn't feel like she belonged in her small community and how much better she feels being in Paris. But their major point of the plot is that she will go back to her small community for midsummer celebrations. I think the book is a product of its time. It was released in 2008. And in 2008, probably what was seen as an artful reflection of society and human relationships and human life. In 2023, it kind of came off as a cliche. To me, it felt like the relationship between Irina and her girlfriend Frida, it didn't feel like full, genuine love. It felt more like another part of Irina's obsession with Frida Kahlo, and she was very obsessed with Frida Kahlo. By the end of the book, she kind of recognizes it, but still. So it didn't feel so genuine as I would have liked it to be. But I think the book captured 13-year-old girl's thoughts about society, community, friends, and becoming an adult really well. And it was interesting to read. And I thought Selma's thoughts regarding how, like, for so many people it was more important to have this picture perfect looking life, while behind the scenes everyone's lives was a mess. The book doesn't have like major plot twists or major drama. It feels very much like daily life written down. That's not necessarily like a bad thing. Irina telling her family about dating Frida and, like having a girlfriend and not being interested in boys was a major part of the plot, and like the reasons why she felt suffocated in the small community that they lived in was an important part of the story as well. This book wasn't like a great wow reading experience, but it wasn't a bad reading experience either. The second Finnish book that I read this year is Tove Jansson's Kesäkirja, and this has been translated into English. It's called Summer Book, and I highly recommend reading this. This tells kind of a generational story of a grandmother and her grandchild and their days at their summer cottage in the Finnish islands. It has been said that part of the story is about Tove Jansson's relatives, but also it's fictional as well. It feels like such a soothing, comforting hug. Your soul rests while reading this book. The imagery of the Finnish islands and the nature and the summer cottage, they feel very vivid, and you can imagine yourself in the summer just calmly enjoying your life. The language that Tove Jansson uses is so beautiful. It's, like I said, very vivid. I really loved this book. It marked 50 years since its release last year. So this is a special edition, and it also like depicts ways that the grandma would maybe get annoyed by her grandchild's constant questions regarding life and existence, but it was such a human reaction as well. Now, my family has never had a summer cottage. I've never been to the Finnish islands that are like in the southern part of Finland, or like by the coast of Finland. But even though it's not exactly my experience of Finland, I could still connect to it as a Finnish person. Tove Jansson obviously created Moomins. I would love to read more of her Moomins books. That's a goal for next year, definitely. I've read one like years ago and I loved it. Highly recommend finding the English translation of this book, or if you're Finnish, read. I don't know if this is kind of random, but I feel most connected to being Finnish in autumn. You would probably think that it would be winter, and it definitely is, but something about falling leaves and kind of the grayness of the weather and kind of the melancholy of the nature really reminds me of being Finnish and Finland. And I think because many of the traditional foods that my mom makes, they are at their best during autumn, harvest season and everything, that's also connected to it. During September, October, I had this really strong connection to being Finnish, especially in September. And I realized that, I enjoy historical fiction books in English. Should I try to find some in Finnish as well? And I actually found two by Heidi Köngäs. They are called Sandra and Mirjami. Actually, I found these initially in the spring, but then at the time I was like, maybe not now. Then in the autumn, I got the feeling to read them. This was a problem when I talked about this in a previous video though. Sandra is a young woman about to be married in the beginning of the book, and she has a wonderful husband, they have children, but then the husband by accident joins the civil war that happened in Finland in 1980. So in the civil war we had the red side, that was mostly peasants, and then the white side, that was an organized military kind of. So right after independence there was this brutal civil war in Finland, and this kind of reflects on that era. So Sandra is this new wife with small children, and then her husband ends up kind of accidentally join the civil war on the red side. And the book focuses a lot on Sandra's experiences and how lost she felt, how alone she felt, and how confused she felt, especially there's this depiction of violence and brutalization and how like awful it is. The book also shares additional two perspectives: Sandra's sister-in-law and then also Sandra's descendant. I think it was a great-granddaughter who didn't know any of this happening, but she found documents and pictures from the time. I thought this book was really well written, and I could feel the human experience through the words of the time. Obviously it's historical fiction, but still. And civil war as a topic in Finland is still kind of a difficult thing to talk about, and I think this book did it really well. Then Mirjami by Heidi Köngäs is not a sequel to Sandra, but it's about the same family. Mirjami is Sandra's daughter, and the book also shares the perspective of Annika, another one of Sandra's daughters. I think it also had Sandra's perspective, but it's been a while, so I don't remember. That depicts the time of Winter War, a little bit of continuation war as well. And Miriam is a young woman in her 20s. She works as a seamstress when the war begins. Her brothers go into the war. It's about like her experiences and the whole family's experiences, kind of reading the news, hoping for the best, but knowing how bad it can be, and like acquaintances being killed and so on. And then Mirjami falls in love with Thor, and Thor is also a soldier, but he eventually gets discharged because he is severely ill. I think it was tuberculosis. And they have big dreams, but those kind of cease to exist because of Thor's disease. But they try their best to get through it, but eventually love isn't enough. I like this book, but I preferred Sandra because Mirjami had kind of a weak ending that was not very satisfying as a reader. I really loved both of these books, but Sandra was a bit better. Then the fifth Finnish book I read this year was also originally first written in Swedish, called Molly and Henry by Kjell. Kjell is a very popular Finnish author, but I haven't read his books before. Molly and Henry is a very new book. It was released this autumn, so I borrowed it from the library because I was very interested in the premise. So Molly is an actress and Henry is a journalist. During Winter War, Henry ends up going to the war as a journalist to kind of depict what is happening in the battlefield, while Molly is on tour with her theatre company. You know, they are in Sweden, and they also do plays and movies in Finland as well. The book starts with kind of them trying to communicate during war, you know, letters and phone calls. Then the war ends, and we see how Henry being at war as a journalist, how it impacts Molly and Henry's relationship, and how it impacts their acquaintances, their family. It's very interesting. But at times I felt like it was too much of like relationship drama, when I was more interested in the aspects of psychological impacts of war and how we communicate and connect with other people after experiencing something so horrible. But then again, I guess that relationship drama was a consequence of that. But yeah, at times I felt like, okay, I'm not really here for this kind of drama. Also, I do want to mention, like, at times I was a bit uncomfortable with how Henry sometimes described Molly's body and other female characters' bodies. And it also always gives me this kind of like, okay, is this commentary on male gaze and misogyny? Or is it just male gaze and misogyny? I haven't read Kjell books before. I really hope it's commentary on how men view women as kind of these objects at times. It's not fair to assume that because character is a certain way, that's the way the author is. But there have been times where I've read a book and the characterization of women has been lacking and objectifying, and then the author has been like, well, no, it wasn't commentary on misogyny or anything. So I had this inner battle of like, is it commentary or is it just misogyny? I am leaning towards commentary. This book also had alternating perspectives, so the book was divided into sections, and within section there would be like 6 to 8 chapters. it would be first from Molly's perspective, 6 to 8 chapters in her perspective, and then Henry's, and so on. And I think this worked really well. Obviously, within these sections, you only get one perspective of certain events, but then later on you will hear the other person's perspective as well. I think I did like this book. However, Joel had a really good point, because when I told him what happened in the end, and then he was like, well, did you like the book? And I was like, well, I'm not sure. It's hard to say. And then he was like, well, you did share what happened at the end of the book very in a monotone way. While if you've really enjoyed a book, you usually have some kind of emotional reaction to it. So maybe it leaned towards like, I'm happy that I read it, but I'm not sure if I liked it. Maybe it would be like a 2.5 to 3 stars. I don't usually rate books, but I feel like I needed that for this one. Right, so those were the 5 Finnish books I read this year. The goal is to read a bit more next year. I'll try to find books that I enjoy, and books that are not just by Tove Jansson or Heidi Köngers. I loved their writing, but I'll try to find other Finnish books as well. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I see you in the next one. Bye!